Yeah, yeah, we got people coming in, which is nice. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, well, if you're ready, then I'm ready. We'll get going. Make sure everything's quiet. Phones are silenced and everything. Okay.
That's a good reminder for me. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations. Glad to see our audience coming in to hear today's talk. Before we get going on today's talk though, I do have a couple of announcements. Firstly, next week we have Betsy Richard. She's going to be giving a presentation on theater for social justice. So please join us at 12 noon next Thursday for that. Same bat time, same bat channel. And next quarter, we're going to be doing our series on race in America and beyond. And that will be starting up on April 15th. We'll have more details up on our website as we get that hammered out. But for now, if you want to mark your calendars, if you're curious, we go into at the end of March, or in the middle of March, we go into spring break. And then the next quarter will start, and then we will begin our sessions on April 15th. And again, those will be Thursdays at noon. This week, I'm very pleased to welcome Trey Batey as our speaker. Originally from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, Trey received his bachelor's degree in anthropology with a focus on forensic anthropology from Louisiana State University, go Tigers. He began teaching in graduate school, also a time when his research interests drifted into bioarchaeology, which looked to interpret past human behavior from skeletal remains. He's worked on archaeological projects in the American South and Midwest, Northwest Mexico, and the Middle East, both Jordan and Syria. While living in Oregon, he worked with heritage specialists, other archaeologists, and the general public on the preservation of historical cemeteries. In 2015, Trey joined LCC's social science faculty as an instructor of anthropology and sociology, where he challenges students to look beyond the familiar and see themselves within the broader social and cultural contexts to which they belong. Please welcome Dr. Trey Batey. Trey, I can't hear you. See the, there we go. Okay. I'd accidentally hit the mute button there. All right. So, thanks everyone for coming to the talk today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Courtney, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And this is a topic that I'm really interested in. And I just want to say sort of at the forefront, and I mentioned this to Courtney as well. So as you can tell from the intro that Courtney read, most of my education and training doesn't directly necessarily apply to this topic that I'm talking about today, but it's one that broadly is related to the social sciences and behavioral sciences. And a lot of the topics I do talk about in some of my other classes, but it's not necessarily a topic that I have my own personal, research background in. All right, so I wouldn't necessarily refer to myself as an expert specifically with this topic, but it's just one that I'm really interested in. And so because of that, while we're going, feel free to submit comments into the chat if you have a specific question or just a comment you'd like to share. Courtney has agreed to sort of moderate those, and if something sort of looks like it could flow into the presentation, we could maybe take those as I go, and I think there should be time left over for questions if folks have questions. So the title here, Manufacturing Consent and Cultural Hegemony.
just to kind of get us started here in terms of thinking about what these ideas relate to, I wanted to share just a few quotes from sort of a more recent treatment of the concept of event. This one I thought was really powerful, quote from Malcolm X. Here's one. The next two here are from the authors of the book Manufacturing Consent that we'll talk about here in just a second. So this is from Edward S. Herman, one of the book's co-authors. And then the last quote here is from the second co-author, maybe the individual that folks would just recognize the name of a little bit more readily. At least I know that was the case for me, and that's Noam Chomsky. Okay, so you guys have had a second to read those. Just to start us off here, looking at the text of Manufacturing Consent. So this was a book that Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky published in 1988. So, you know, it's over 30 years old now. So a little dated, but I think, or at least sort of my goal here is in talking about sort of the crux of this book that they wrote. Maybe we can see how a lot of what they talked about in the book certainly applies to the media landscape that we see today. Right. So in this book, sort of the main meat of it is something that they introduced, what they called the propaganda model. And even though they were co-authors, in reading some interviews with Noam Chomsky, he gives most of the credit for developing, sort of articulating the model to Edward S. Herman. So Herman died recently in 2017 at the age of 92. He was an economist, media scholar, social critic. And then some of you guys might be a little bit more familiar with Noam Chomsky, who also just recently turned 92. And I, you know, one, it'd be really cool to live to 92, but I also hope that my mind is as sharp as his is at 92. It's pretty ridiculous. But at any rate, Chomsky, you know, really revolutionized the field of linguistics, known as a linguist, cognitive scientist, social critic, and maybe even more so known as a political activist, especially, you know, probably within the last 20 years, but certainly earlier in his life as well, specifically political activism against the Vietnam War. So Chomsky, currently he's has emeritus status at MIT. He's still teaching. He began teaching at the University of Arizona as a laureate professor of linguistics there, which is pretty amazing. The two, both Herman and Chomsky, they had collaborated on, I want to say, 2 or 3 other books prior to Manufacturing Consent. Those were mostly looking at sort of the politics of aggression, specifically related to the US government. And those were published in the sort of mid to late 70s. And so a lot of their early work was sort of looking at US military aggression, specifically related to the Vietnam War. So the sort of what they outline in the book is this model that they call the propaganda model. It's sort of a critical analysis of mass media. And they were just in looking, sort of reading the book, and they sort of put this out there explicitly. They were really influenced by some of the early 20th century founders of media studies, in particular, one that they cite frequently, and this is something that that I've seen Chomsky mention also in interviews, is the influence of Walter Lippmann. In particular, his book Public Opinion, which was published in 1922. And in that text, Lippmann sort of made the argument that, as you can see here, that propaganda is really an essential tool. It plays a critical role in what he called the manufacture of consent. So it was actually Lippmann's writing that they sort of took. That's where they borrowed that for the title of their book. So the manufacture of consent of the people, and is again at that time in the early 20th century what he called a regular organ of popular government, right? So before we get like deep into the sort of outline of what makes up the propaganda model, I wanted to just maybe take a quick step back and kind of put this model in a little bit of a broader sort of analytical framework. Courtney, I saw you laughing, so I hope some other folks are maybe laughing at this meme. I thought it was great. Karl Marx memes are hard, and they're some of the best. So hopefully you guys are enjoying that. In manufacturing consent, Herman and Chomsky sort of approach, and you may have noticed it in the title or the subtitle, their analysis is sort of within the framework of what would be called political economy. And if you're sort of wondering, what that is, this is what I thought was a good description of it from one of the cultural anthropology texts that I use in my classes. So just to read it here: political economy, a framework of analysis that contextualizes relations within state structures, political processes, social structures, and cultural values. And really, that sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but what it means is sort of recognizing that that economies, economic relations, they don't take place within a vacuum. Economic relationships are always going to be tied to and integrated into political processes, the social structures and institutions that a society has at its disposal, and also the social norms and cultural values of that society, and maybe even not just of that one society, but of the different subgroups within that society as well, right? So it tries to contextualize those types of interactions. And sort of one other thing that sort of related to political economy and sort of thinking of how all these things are related in terms of sort of putting my anthropologist hat on, that is very much related to the anthropological concept of holism, sort of this idea that if you're trying to understand, either some particular facet of a society's behavior, ritual, practice, belief, whatever those things are, those social institutions, it's really difficult to understand any one of those things in isolation, and really sort of to understand whatever it is, that phenomenon that the observer is looking at. Because human behavior is so complex, you have to sort of understand it within the context of those other things. And so this kind of leads me to this great quote from Karl Marx here. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And specifically, that quote is very much sort of reflective of a concept that, you know, if any of my sociology students are in here, would recognize as being what the 20th century American sociologist C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. So trying to understand oneself, one's behavior, one's circumstances, and even those of the groups that we belong to, sort of in that broader context of social processes, historical processes that have sort of led up to whatever that current moment is, right? So again, it's really getting this idea of not viewing these things in isolation. So they're sort of using this framework of political economy. And broadly speaking, and this is why I kind of tied this into the title, the book is sort of in a general sense about the production of what we would call cultural hegemony. And so just to kind of break down what that term is. So if we just look at hegemony by itself, it comes from the Greek, I'm going to see if I can get this right, emonia. We'll see. At least that's what Google Translate said it. I should say it like. And that just sort of by itself is we can sort of think of as dominance or control. You know, if we're sort of thinking of maybe antiquity, right, classical Greece, that idea is sort of dominance or control of the dominant city-state over other city-states, right? So that dominant city-state would be the hegemon over those other city-states. Now, the idea of hegemony has been applied sort of across the social sciences, from political science to anthropology, sociology, you know, geopolitics, all sorts of areas. Specifically, the idea of cultural hegemony is one that was developed in the sort of early 1900s by an Italian philosopher, writer, journalist, politician, Antonio Gramsci. And so this is a picture of Gramsci over there on the right. So in the 1920s, so he's probably in his early 30s, around 30 in this portrait here. And just a little background on Gramsci is, so he was very much influenced by Karl Marx, the writings of Marx, and his frequent collaborator, Friedrich Engels. And he, relatively early in his career, became sort of a leading figure in the Communist Party of Italy. And he was very involved in sort of pro-worker, anti-fascist movements of that time. And then in 1926, Benito Mussolini's government began cracking down on opposition parties in Italy. And during that time, Gramsci was imprisoned. So he was in prison, like in one prison for a year, and then like immediately slapped with a much longer sentence. I want to say of about like 30 years and sent to another prison. And so he spent the next 11 years in prison, actually wound up dying in prison. But during those 11 years in prison, he, you know, while his health was deteriorating, he wrote tons and tons and tons. And in that time is whenever he sort of developed this idea of cultural hegemony. So, you know, if we think of hegemony as being dominance or control, cultural hegemony then is the idea that within a diverse society, so a culturally diverse society, the class within that society, the dominant class within that society, tends to sort of influence the broader culture in such a way so that the lower classes within the society tend to sort of adopt and accept sort of the cultural norms, worldviews, perspectives of the ruling class within society. And so basically what that's suggesting is that dominant class within society sort of is setting the agenda, so to speak, and the lower classes within society come to sort of accept those conditions, the conditions that they find themselves in, as sort of the natural order of things, and sort of tend to accept the status quo, right? And so, you know, Herman and Chomsky are sort of borrowings, you know, they're kind of taking this political economy perspective, kind of building on some of this work of kind of in this Marxist tradition of sort of looking at imbalances in power and inequalities in power within society. And this is sort of building the foundation of what they would ultimately come up with there as the propaganda model. So again, you know, any sociology students might be having some flashbacks, right? Thinking about conflict theory. Okay, so what exactly is the propaganda model? So the propaganda model, I think maybe other places I just write PM, so we'll just leave it there. So what the propaganda model does is it's a tool that they developed that seeks to explain how the media behaves by looking, again, kind of that political economy approach, looking at the different institutional pressures that tend to influence the choices that those entities that produce media sort of influence the decisions on the content that they produce, right? So in particular, their focus was looking at the media landscape and sort of doing this analysis, looking at media in the US. So their model was sort of developed specifically in looking at profit-driven media, right? Or media within a profit-driven system, i.e. capitalism, right? So the gist of the model is that media companies, large corporations, but those entities that produce media, the media that they produce goes through a series of filters before it actually reaches sort of the general public, right? Or the consumer, right? And so this is just this is about the best graphic I could find here. Couldn't come up with any other funneling system. It would have taken me too long to draw with clip art or something. So we start up top there with the raw news, right? And then the first filter is ownership. Here we're just talking about the sort of looking at who owns the entities that produce media. The second is advertising, specifically that advertising is the major revenue source for media entities. Sourcing relates to the sort of accepted personalities, institutions that serve as experts for information. So what and who do the media organizations see as the source of the of quote unquote news, right? The next one is what Herman and Chomsky referred to as Flak. So this represents sort of opportunities of disciplining the media if they sort of step out of line in terms of, you know, what type of information is allowed and maybe not allowed. And then the last one is an external threat. And the asterisk there is because in the original, in the 1988 book, they listed this as anti-communism. And that's mainly just because, again, that was, just prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. But sort of, it's definitely kind of mired in that Cold War era. So really what they were talking about, just sort of tossing out the term anti-communism, really what they were talking about is any type of external threat. And so we're going to take a look at these in a little bit more detail. And, there's a really good video here, but I almost don't know if I want to show it. It lasts about 4 minutes or so. It's just really good. Let me try one second. So this is 4 minutes and 46 seconds. I think we can do this, and then I'll just keep going. But this is really great. It's a really succinct, fun little animation that talks about these filters here. So if I hit full screen, how does that look? Good? Okay.
Can you make it louder? Trey, can you make it louder?
Freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky,
Or if it has subtitles, can you put that on?
manufacturing consent. It lasted upon prediction that media apps.
Courtney, is the sound not coming through?
Sound's not coming through very well. If it's got subtitles, can you put those on or crank up the volume more?
Sure. I will crank it up. And look, if this doesn't get better, we can keep going. All right, let's see.
As a check on political power, that media inform the public, serve the public, so that we can better engage in the political process. In fact, media manufacture our consent. They tell us what those in power need them to tell us so we can fall in line. Democracy is staged with the help of media that work as propaganda machines. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their end game, profit. And so it's in their interest to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources stray away from the consensus, they get Flak. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the Flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters. One big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all the time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for bearing with me and getting the audio in tune. So I wasn't sure if I'd have time to share that little clip. I've got a link at the end of the slideshow. I've got a link that of a little YouTube playlist that I put together that includes this video, but I thought it was just so well done and succinct, and I'm in love with Amy Goodman, who was the narrator there. So I wanted to share it with you guys. So, oh, stop. Okay, so is the screen still being shared? Okay. Next, I just want to go through in a little bit more detail, looking at the 5 filters, and then by the time we get to the 5th filter, really that's going to wrap it up, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So again, ownership is the first filter. So here, what Herman and Chomsky were really looking at, they were looking at not only the size of the media entities, but also the concentrated ownership of them, right? And that's something that we'll talk about in the next slide, media consolidation. So they were looking at size and the concentrated ownership of the media, also at the owner wealth. So they were looking at things like the personal wealth of the CEOs of some of these organizations, but also looking at the income, revenue, wealth of the companies themselves. And then sort of this idea that again, these are, well, now, and even at the time of the original writing, these are giant corporations, potentially based in the US, but still oftentimes multinational conglomerates, right? And these companies exist within a capitalist system where the incentive is to maximize profit, so that there's a profit orientation, and that really dominates these corporations. So excuse me. So just kind of looking at media consolidation, this is really interesting to sort of see the trajectory that this has taken, in the last half century. Definitely since the 1980s, we have seen, a really rapid and drastic consolidation of major media sources. In 1983, there were about 50 firms that owned sort of the bulk of mass media outlets in the US. Largely starting in the 1980s with President Reagan's deregulation, that really kind of ushered in sort of this situation where you really didn't have these regulations in terms of like the size of the audience that media companies could reach, the sort of the expanse of the different like companies that can actually like be consolidated, looking maybe we're consolidating. So a lot of regulations that had been in place from sort of the 30s through the 70s during the 1980s. And this isn't something that is, purely sort of like a sort of issue either, because in the 1990s, this sort of process in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act, which really was sort of a lobbyists of the large media companies. So it raised the caps on, for example, the number of local news that a single corporation can own, and again, the percentage of the national audience that any one entity. This is a really interesting graphic here. You can sort of see, who are the kind of the big players. Right. So we have Comcast, News Corp, Disney, and CBS. And this could very easily of these companies, in the future, right? And not that long ago, as Comcast was trying to merge with Time Warner, that I think even recently Viacom and I want to say maybe CBS were potentially in talks of merging. Of merging. So this is something that potentially could continue, right? Where now that we have this system of an oligopoly, and we could be sort of continuing that path toward monopoly. And it's sort of interesting to think about maybe the effects of this this sort of consolidation in media, and maybe how that might sort of be consumed and realized by the public, based on demographics. So I thought this was a really interesting, some interesting data here. So this is from the Pew Research Center, a survey that they did in 2016. So you can sort of see of US adults who often get news on each of these platforms, right? So it's just like what type of using. So you can still see, the majority, 57%, cable, nightly news on TV, 38% online, social media, website, radio, and then 20% print newspapers. And then, it's interesting too, when you sort of look at the demographic break. And this is something that probably, I imagine, folks would sort of suspect that TV sort of less utilized by younger age demographics. And that's sort of the sort of pattern that you see with radio and print newspapers as well. And some other things in thinking about media consolidation and maybe some of its effects, some things that researchers have looked at, sort of sort of applied, aspects of the propaganda model more recently. One of the effects of media consolidation is that it not only restricts sort of the variety of content, right? We might have tons and tons of channels to choose from, but they're all playing the same thing. So, do we really have choice there? So not only restricting the content variety, but also shifting news coverage sort of away from what's happening at the local level, where more stories are focused sort of regionally, nationally, or even on sort of world news. And one of the things sort of interesting is that like in 2014, Mother Jones had a really interesting report that found about only 1/4 of local TV stations were actually producing their own content. So the next filter, advertising, at the issue of the primary income and revenue source of mass media advertising dollars, right? They're not being sustained by the consumer, right? They're being sustained, they can accrue, right? And so this sort of this environment where it's actually the advertisers' choices that end whether sort of how prosperous that media entity is, and whether or not it survives. And if that's the situation, right, you sort of predict that, well, if it's the advertising dollars that are sort of the lifeblood of these media entities, then that's going to incentivize those outlets to produce media that is going to attract more advertising dollars, and not scare advertisers away, right? So it more has to do with the advertising and getting those advertising dollars for income and revenue than it does putting out certain thresholds of quality of content, or the content itself in terms of what either the news or entertainment is actually covering. So again, they're just thinking about maybe some aspects of how influencing media today. One of the really interesting sort of piece to this is what has been dubbed adpocalypse. So I want to say in 2019, so just a couple years ago, YouTube sort of dropped many of its content producers, in which a lot of independent media were demonetized, right? And if those content creators, they might not be able to keep on making that content, right? And so this is way, like when we think about the internet, and maybe the knee-jerk reaction is, wow, the internet seems like it would provide an outlet and maybe an escape for the need for those advertising dollars. But what has happened since the advent of the internet is those large media entities sort of caught on, and now they have been sort of just flooding the internet with their own content, right? And so again, you kind of have that situation where whatever the application, whatever the particular website, whatever it is that maybe is going to be hosting content, if it potentially influences advertisers to not give ad revenue, then they might not be wanting to put that content out. I thought this was really interesting. And this is something that we've seen. So this was also a tweet, but it's really interesting how that demonetization has affected folks. Much of it is determined simply by the algorithms that Google and you to sort of target content that maybe is offensive, or or whatever that is. And so what you wind up having is a situation like this one, right, where that has a lot of content related to Nazi propaganda, because the propaganda, but the algorithm treats it just like someone espousing Nazi propaganda, like advocating for it, right? And the algorithm isn't distinguishing those two things, right? And so that's potentially one area where this sort of concentration on that advertising revenue is problematic. And Courtney, whenever I saw this one, because it was a history, related to history, I thought of you and definitely had to include it there. The next one, sourcing. Again, this relates to the different sort of quote unquote experts, where the news is actually coming from, right? So the news is being put out there by the media entities, but where are they getting that information? Well, it's sort of this like revolving door where you have, the experts of the government or specific institutions, right? They're working in government. They have a close working relationship with the individuals that are actually on air, those anchors. The government itself, those institutions also have close relationships media organizations as well, right? So it's this sort of like revolving door. And just as an example, we can look at other examples too, but one that I thought was sort of sort of this particular filter, as we look at, sort of look back at the run up to war, right? 2002, 2003, there was just constant, right? Weapons of mass destruction, right? You got the folks there looking at it. You got here again, nations, right? Making, presenting evidence, right? Weapons of mass. They never found any weapons of mass destruction, right? So, but Colin Powell's position had that sort of expert, legitimized role where, like, okay, if this expert is saying it, right, then it must be true, right? So that's sort of that idea of sourcing. The next, again, so the next filter, again, this is filter number 4. This is Flak. And this is, again, a means of disciplining the media. So whenever the media steps out of line, right, there are repercussions for that, right? So this could include anything from disciplining journalists or news organizations, potentially just complaints, maybe lawsuits, right? Litigation, petitions, government sanctions, right? So any number of means to sort of discipline or sort of dissuade journalists and media content producers from sort of stepping outside the lines. And just of this, one that I thought was, certainly relevant was the story of Omar Jimenez. So he was a CNN reporter in Minneapolis, covering sort of what was happening in the and you know he was arrested, right? They were sort of moving back to where the law enforcement had said that they should move back to in that particular instance. A few years ago, so I believe this was in say, actually, I think it may have been in 2016. Amy Goodman, longtime investigative journalist, has worked for The Intercept, has the show Democracy Now! She was at Standing Rock, right, covering the protests there for the Dakota Access Pipeline. A warrant was issued for her arrest for the charge of inciting a riot. The judge actually wound up tossing out the charge. But in any case, sort of the sort of the action was still there, right? Like, hey, if you're sort of covering this, presenting it a certain way, drawing, certain attention to this particular issue, we're not going to be having that. And then the last one is, again, sort of the external threat, or sort of the common enemy. Again, in their original working, it was anti-communism, sort of in the Cold War era. More recently, in sort of the post 9/11 world, we could sort of look at things like terrorism, energy insecurity, those types of things, perhaps, as sort of things that might fall into this external threat category. In a lot of ways, this sort of serves as a control mechanism. And some of this can be seen in those that like the personalities of the media, like the language that they certain topics. It was really interesting. Again, not in 2017, Brian Williams, the anchor, received a for the language that he used during the airstrike, the U.S. airstrike on Syria. Praise the beautiful weapons a few different times. He was criticized for that. More recently, or maybe just within the last couple years, we could look at that sort of idea of the external threat, use that as a framework for understanding maybe why in of some conflicts, but less of others, and the language that media uses to explain and talk about those different conflicts, right? So, for example, again, the Iraq War, with the Syrian airstrike, those were covered, often cable news network, maybe just like 24/7, but maybe whenever you have that, certainly the U.S. is involved in through military aid, like the war between, and that has received much less media coverage. And again, a lot of that Herman and Chomsky would sort of look at is they would say that, yeah, well, that's what the model would depending on what those geopolitical interests are of the government, that's different things are covered. And just to kind of wrap up here, and I totally, but I just want to conclude here with this quote from Edward, again, co-author of Manufacturing Consent. And I think it's really interesting. So he said, we would help activists understand where they might best deploy their efforts to influence mainstream media coverage of issues. So I think whenever, so one of the things that, both he and Chomsky were hoping was that in some ways, this model could be used as a tool, right? So if you sort of are working within, sort of the framework of these might be the incentives that larger media corporations have, and it's going to sort of, it predicts that they're going to behave in certain ways. How can we maybe navigate around those things to maybe present different views to the consumer? I was holding that cough in for a while, so I apologize. That's all I have. I'd love to hear, again, we've got some time for questions, comments. I've got a few references here. And if you access the slides, if you click a YouTube playlist with about 4 videos, most of it's maybe interviews with Chomsky, that little short video I ground into sort of just his perspective and the basic ideas of the model.
All right, thank you. First thing I want to say is, where was that short video when I had to read manufacturing consent in grad school? I really could have used that. That was very, very helpful. We do have a couple questions coming in. So Sean had a question. As mass media is becoming more formal than informal on questions and answers, will this change in against the concept or foundation of the propaganda model, especially as there are more ways to receive and send information? That also, like, I was questioning where social media really fits into that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, it is really interesting. Again, kind of like you would think that, the idea of the internet was like it was going to, media, right? And you're going to have all these independent creators, but the problem is sort of onset, right? You had like, sort of a handful of entities that have now so much of what we see online, that it's really kind of drowning independent voices. And then 2, when you get to that idea of I mean, YouTube tool, if let's say you're producing content, maybe making videos, like exploring like the idea of white supremacy, like the algorithm's gonna boom strike you down, and then what? Next thing you know, again, what that winds up doing is funnel, or it sort of makes content. It's like you can't deal with important critical issues, but everything then turns to pure entertainment, sex, violence, and that's something that they touch on in the book too.
Yeah, and I definitely, especially with when you consider local news and stuff, if it bleeds, it leads. The whole notion of sort of sensationalization of the news, and this is not new. I mean, we could go back to the 1890s and talk about yellow journalism, which I do in my class. That's definitely there. The other question was about Sinclair. Sinclair political messaging inside local news. How much further could this go, and are there ways to prevent it?
Well, it's interesting. Reading a couple articles about the Sinclair group, their acquisition of the Tribune, that they were trying to do. That was just a few years ago. Opening, and as far as I'm concerned, I kind of feel that was like a near miss, because they already have such a strong sway on that. If they were to sort of increase, that acquisition would have put them just way ahead of any other sort of maybe, but just a larger corporation that has control of a lot of local markets. So in time, the current FCC chair, Ajit Pai, he at least in his public statements for more deregulation. You hear him talk about synergy a lot, which is a little bit get a little. But I'll be interested to see too what that might look like. Oh, Courtney, you're muted.
I just saw that. Betsy says, Trey, great explanation of PM and very engaging. Thanks so much. And I want to echo that. And we are actually out of time, but I want to thank Trey and have a chance to do a little clapping here. And I'm sure some of our participants who are quiet are doing that as well. But thank you very much, Trey, for giving us a rundown on this. I think this is very useful when we look at media and how it's constructed and limited and filtered. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.